She did not ask for a guardian. She asked for a work order, a bunk assignment, and to be left alone with both. Elin Voss had run solo salvage routes through the Kessa Drift for 6 years before the Colonial Survey ever put her on a crude station, and she had the scars, 3 of them, 1 per hand and 1 across her jaw, to prove she had survived every one of those years without a partner watching her back. When Station Command assigned her a technical liaison for the Halden Outpost refit, she read the order once, walked to the administrator's office, and said she worked alone. The administrator said the assignment stood. She said fine, but he stays out of her way. He was already out of her way. That was the arrangement he made without telling anyone, including her. Dov Kessler had 2 commendations for structural diagnostics and a habit of saying almost nothing in meetings, which made him easy to underestimate and easier to ignore. When Elin told him on his first day that she didn't need anyone looking out for her, he said okay. He did not argue. He did not explain himself. He filed the paperwork that put his workstation 2 corridors from hers, requested the overnight diagnostics shift so their schedules would barely overlap, and never once offered to walk her anywhere. He agreed to every term she set. Then he spent 2 years quietly rewriting the outpost around her without her noticing, because the alternative was noticing her get hurt. Parenthetical. Kessler kept a logbook of his own maintenance requests under a false priority code, filed as routine hull inspection, because routine drew no questions and no thanks. The pattern took root in small, deniable places, and it did not stay small. The first was a pressure seal on the corridor outside her quarters, flagged for replacement 11 months before it was due to fail under the outpost's own maintenance schedule. He ran the stress numbers himself, off the books, on a night shift no one audited because the official schedule had it slated for monitor only. He replaced it during a window logged as unrelated conduit work, a job that took him 4 hours longer than the paperwork claimed, and he never mentioned the discrepancy to anyone. The second was a supply run to the outer ring that she always took alone, on a route the manifest listed as low risk. He had quietly rerouted a debris-tracking satellite to sweep the corridor twice as often. After a near miss, he never reported to her. A fragment cluster that passed close enough to her shuttle's telemetry log that he found it during a routine data pull and sat with the readout for a long time before deciding not to tell her, because telling her would have meant explaining why he was watching her telemetry at all. The third was a reassignment order that would have put her on a joint EVA with a technician who had 2 write-ups for cutting corners on tether checks. Kessler filed a competing request for that technician's transfer before the order ever reached her desk, timed precisely enough that it read as an ordinary scheduling conflict and not as anyone's intervention. He did not know, until months later, that the technician's tether had failed on a different EVA with a different partner, on the far side of the outpost, and that his own quiet paperwork was the only reason it hadn't been Elin on the other end of that line. The fourth was smaller than the others and cost him more. During a fever that kept her in her quarters for 2 days, the kind of illness she would have called nothing, had anyone asked. He ran a diagnostic sweep of her section's air recyclers on a hunch, found a filtration fault that had been quietly elevating particulate levels for weeks, and fixed it under a work order for an unrelated ventilation complaint from 3 sections over. He sat outside her door that night for 11 minutes with a ration of broth he did not know how to justify delivering, decided against knocking, and left it outside instead, unlabeled, the kind of thing that could have come from anyone. She never asked who left it. She assumed the mess hall had started doing rounds for anyone logged as off-shift sick. She ate it and went back to sleep. Parenthetical, the outpost safety officer once asked Kessler why his hull inspection logs were 3 times longer than anyone else's. He said he liked being thorough. He did not say whose corridor he inspected first every time for 2 years. The insult, if she had known to call it that, was never in what he did. It was in what she had already survived without anyone doing it for her. She did not need saving. She had never needed saving. What she could not have accounted for, because she had never been given the chance to, was a version of care that asked nothing of her, that made no claim on her gratitude, her attention, or her account of herself. She had built a life on the premise that needing no one meant no one could disappoint her. Kessler never gave her the opportunity to find out whether he would. What it cost him never showed up in any log. He had turned down a transfer to a research vessel in the first year, a genuine advancement, because the position would have taken him off Halden entirely, and he could not think of a version of leaving that didn't end with nobody checking that corridor seal on schedule. He told the administrator he preferred fieldwork to a desk. He did not tell anyone the real reason, because the real reason required explaining an arrangement he had never been asked to make and could not defend if asked. There were nights he sat in his own quarters running numbers on failure probabilities for systems that were, by every official measure, fine, because fine was a number that could still be wrong. And he had decided a long time ago that he would rather spend 2 years being quietly, uselessly careful than one day be right about something too late to matter. The discovery, when it came from the record, not from him. A reactor coolant leak on the outpost's lower ring forced an emergency evacuation drill in the 14th month of the second year, the kind of drill that pulls every technician's service log for review. Elin was assigned to audit the maintenance histories of every section on the evacuation route, a task she took because she trusted her own eye over anyone else's. She found her name in Kessler's logs first, not as a subject, never as a subject, but as a location. Corridor 4 adjacent to Voss quarters, inspection frequency, double standard. Supply route Kess 7 adjacent to Voss route, satellite sweep, doubled unlogged reason. Ventilation fault, section 9, cross-reference to a personal quarters filtration report filed under an unrelated complaint. She sat with the file for 11 minutes before she understood what she was looking at. She sat with it for another 40 before she understood how long it had been going on. And a third stretch of time she didn't measure at all before she understood what the technicians averted tether failure meant about the EVA reassignment she'd never known had been rerouted around her. She did not confront him with anger. She confronted him with the file open on a tablet, set flat on the table between them, and asked him to explain the entries one by one. He did. He answered every question without defending a single one of them, because he had never expected to need a defense. He had built the whole arrangement to never require her permission, precisely so she would never have to grant it. When she asked why, he was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "You said you didn't need it," he said. "I never said I agreed you were right." She asked him what the broth was, and whether it had been the mess hall. "No," he said, and offered nothing else, because 2 years of practice at not explaining himself did not undo itself in one conversation. Parenthetical, he had rehearsed nothing. It was the only line in 2 years he had let himself think about saying out loud, and it came out smaller than he'd practiced it. The ticking clock was not an alien fleet or a diplomatic ultimatum. It was a transfer order, issued the same week, reassigning Kessler to a survey ship departing in 6 days. The same research vessel posting he had quietly declined once already, reissued now as a formal reassignment he could not decline a second time without cause. It was, on paper, the promotion he had earned 2 years earlier and finally could not outmaneuver. Elin read the order twice, then she did something she had not done in 2 years. She went to the administrator's office and asked, instead of stating that the assignment be reconsidered. She did not tell him she'd done it. She let him find out from the record, the way she had found out about him, because it seemed, suddenly, like the only fair way to say what she meant. There was no battle. There was a hallway outside the administrator's office, and Elin standing in it when Kessler came out, having just read the amended assignment order in definite extension, Joint Technical Liaison, both names on the header. He didn't ask how. She didn't explain. She said only that she'd looked at his logs a second time, after the anger wore off, and counted the number of nights his diagnostics shift had run past the length any actual diagnostic required, sitting 2 corridors from her door for no operational reason at all. She said she'd also found the declined transfer from the first year, buried in a personnel file she had no real authority to be reading, and that finding it had told her more than the broth had. "I didn't need it," she said. "I'm not saying I did. I'm saying I'd rather you stayed anyway." He said okay, the same word he'd used 2 years earlier, and for the first time it meant something different, because this time it was a request instead of a term he'd agreed to on someone else's behalf. Parenthetical, the safety officer, reviewing the new joint liaison paperwork months later, noted that Kessler's inspection logs had gotten shorter. Elin's had started listing his corridor too. She never asked him to stop watching out for her. He never made it a condition of staying. What changed was smaller than either of those things, and it changed in both directions at once. She started leaving the door unlocked on the nights his shift ran late. He stopped filing the inspections under false priority codes because there was no longer anything to hide, and the logs read plainly for the first time in 2 years. Corridor 4, Voss quarters, joint liaison, routine. She started reviewing his numbers before he filed them, not because she doubted them, but because two sets of eyes on a stress calculation was simply better engineering, and she was done pretending she hadn't noticed his were usually right. 6 weeks after the reassignment order was struck down, a second coolant fault turned up on the lower ring, smaller than the first, caught early enough to fix on a standard rotation instead of an emergency drill. It showed up on a joint inspection log, both names on the header, filed on schedule, no false priority code required. Elin closed the ticket herself. Kessler signed off underneath her, and for the first time in 2 years, neither of them was hiding anything the other hadn't already agreed to know. She never called it saving her. She called it the only good argument she'd ever lost, and the only one she was glad to.